Hola chicos, yo soy Kat de Just Cat Books. El día de hoy tenemos una increíble entrevista con la autora CS Pacat,
Hi.
autora de la trilogía del príncipe cautivo, de la trilogía de Dark Rise, publicada por Ediciones Urano. Nice to meet you.
Great to meet you.
Thank you so much. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how did you start writing?
So I was born in Melbourne, but I've lived all over. I've lived in Japan, I've lived in Italy. My family background is Italian. And I started writing, I think like most writers, I started reading.
Yeah.
And especially I grew up in like the 80s and 90s. And I think, especially when I was a young teenager, I didn't really understand that I was queer, but I was really drawn to queer fiction, queer representation.
Yeah.
I felt a connection. But at that time, there was almost no LGBTQ books or representation on screen. And so I grew up sort of hungry for the kind of stories that I could relate to.
Mm-hmm.
And we were talking earlier, but also around that time, then especially into like the late 90s, there started to be a body of queer fiction, but it was all online. Like people that were writing queer stories were kind of doing it underground and doing it online. And I discovered that world, and I started writing at first online fiction, mostly because I didn't believe that a book with queer characters could be published.
Yeah.
That was inconceivable to me at that time. And so I thought of myself not as a writer, but just as someone playing around on the internet. But yeah, I've been lucky enough that people liked my stories, and eventually I was able to be published.
I really like that you mentioned that you started with online fiction.
Yeah.
I think we have a great world of fan fiction around.
Yeah.
And I feel like sometimes we draw inspiration of the authors or the characters that we like. And I know that Anne Rice is one of your inspirations.
Yeah, absolutely.
So aside from her, do you have any other authors that you are drawn to or that you took as reference for your work?
So the authors that I was reading, especially in my teenage years, that I think were really strong influences on me later. Yeah, it was first of all Anne Rice. And I should say, like, her Vampire Chronicles, she wrote them in the 1970s, if you can believe that she was writing such an unabashedly queer story so early. I think, they've just made a TV series of it and it still feels so fresh now, but it's like 50 years old. She's so ahead of her time. There was another writer that I obsessively read called Mercedes Lackey. She wrote this trilogy called Magic's Pawn, which had a gay main character. It's like a fantasy hero's journey. He does have love interests through the book, but it's not primarily a romance, which I think is also very ahead of its time. Even now, I can't really think of just like a fantasy novel that's like a hero's journey with a gay main character. But that was published in 1989. I was reading a lot of Mary Renault. She was a lesbian writer who was writing like in the 1950s, I think, and 60s. And she wrote a book about Alexander the Great called the Alexander Trilogy that explores his queer sexuality. So they were huge influences on me, all three of those.
I'm gonna check them out.
Yeah,
they sound
highly recommend.
Really good.
Yeah, well, some of them, no, it's worth reading, even if just as historical documents.
We're gonna talk a little bit about your trilogy, which is Captive Prince, which it's one of my favorite series, and I gotta say it's because of the incredible world building and all the intricate political plots. I feel like those are the main part of the story. I know that you started publishing online, so
Yeah.
if you could tell us a little bit about that process, how you started publishing, and then how it transitioned to being traditionally published.
Yeah, so as I mentioned when I started writing it, that I just had no idea that this could ever be a book, because there were not really like books like that on commercial bookshelves at that time. It was about 2013, 2014.
Yeah.
And but there was this very vibrant world of online fiction, both fan fiction and original fiction, and some original webcomics that were also inspiring to me. So I started to post this story as a online serial. So I'd post like a chapter every month. And I still remember the first, I didn't think anyone was going to read it. And I remember the first comment that I received to that story was someone saying, "Oh, interesting." And I just reread that comment 100 times, like, "Oh, someone thinks my book is interesting." And yeah, so I think what happened was that the story had a really slow build of word of mouth, and eventually kind of went viral in the same way that, like, but after I'd been posting for about a year and a half, it kind of exploded. Kind of in the same way, like suddenly in season 2, everyone's watching Game of Thrones, but you don't quite know how it started. I got so many requests from readers for like a copy of the book, like a physical copy, that I thought, like, maybe I can get this published. And then I just sent out more than 100 query letters to publishers and agents, telling them about my book, and they all said no. So it was over 100 rejections. And I think the kindest reply that I received at that time was like, "We just don't think there's a market for this kind of book." So I self-published, just because readers kept asking me for the book. And when I self-published, the book took off. It was just hitting #1 across categories on Amazon. Because it was selling so much, a US agent approached me and said, "Let's sell this to a publisher in New York." And we eventually sold it to Penguin Random House. So I think what happened was, like, first of all, there was a market, right? And not only was there a market, but it was like a starving market. Like, it was just because there was just almost no queer stories being published. And so, and then the other thing I think it shows is, like, if something is new, it's, sometimes it has to prove itself before publishers will take a chance on it. Like, for them, new equals like sales ? Like sales 0 or sales ? So yeah, my Captive Prince really had to prove itself in the market before anyone would bet on it.
That's so cool because, as you mentioned, there was a market for it.
Yeah.
Like, they were wrong for it. And people are looking actively for this kind of stories.
Yeah.
Can I ask, who's your favorite character? Aside from Damon and Laurent.
Oh, among the secondary characters?
Yes.
I think it's probably, I should say, I like characters that are annoying. So my favorite secondary character is probably Nikkei's, because I like the kind of character that when they turn up on the page, like, they're going to cause some trouble.
And it's funny that you mentioned him because that's my favorite character too.
Really?
Yeah, he's my baby. I really like him because I feel like, I mean, you have some dark themes or difficult themes on the book, and I feel like Nikkei is one of those characters that had to grow up fast, but he takes advantage, or he knows his environment and makes it work for him.
I think as well, like, at least for me, when I'm exploring those kind of dark themes, and maybe this is kind of a dark thing to say, but for me, it's important to show that, like, yes, some people can have a happy ending when something like that happens to them, but not everyone will. Like, it actually, not everyone is saved, not everyone is rescued, not everyone gets a happy ending. Like, things can be just, like, really, really dark, actually. That's just reality.
Yeah, that's life.
Yeah. So he's quite kind of a special character to me in that way as well.
And now that you mentioned about real life, happy endings, sad endings, how much do you plan of your stories? Do you take inspiration from your real life?
I think I plan pretty much everything. And especially for Captive Prince, because I was writing chapter by chapter, I think I needed to plan the whole thing first, so I knew where I was going. But I think I write the kind of stories that, like, I really like to plan twists and, like, have these kind of big explosive things happen. I couldn't do that without planning in advance. So I plan everything before I start writing. And even for a trilogy, like I'm planning everything for book 3 before I start writing 1.
Okay.
So, and then like, how much did I draw for my real life? You know, in, in a way, I drew quite a lot from my real life. I won't talk too much about it, but especially, I grew up in a household that was pretty violent. Well, it was extremely violent, and I think, when you grow up in a situation like that, for me at least, a couple of things happen. One is that you really yearn to escape the situation, but you can't because you're a child. So you're often escaping into your head or into a fantasy world or something like that. So, but the kind of stories that I was looking for, like just a normal story about a normal person leading a good life, or like a story where like someone's really good, so good things happen to them. Like I couldn't relate to that kind of story because that was not my experience. So I think like it's not that everything that's in the book is exactly what happened to me, but more like I was wanting the kind of stories that were showing like dark themes and dark situations, because that was relatable to me when I was growing up. And I think it just shows that like all types of stories are important. Like each different person needs a different kind of story that they can relate to. Yeah.
Now that you're talking about planning, because I know that some writers like to just take the pen and see where it takes them, but I feel like you have a little more control where when you plan everything and you have a goal set in mind. So you mentioned that you have, or well, that you like to write plot twists. So we're gonna move on a little bit to your other trilogy, which is Dark Rise. Which I gotta say, it was kind of spoiled to me, and I'm gonna send in quotation marks. Because it was sold to me as unreliable narrator.
Right.
So I kind of expected something to happen. I was like, okay, I can trust this man.
Oh,
but
right, yeah.
I really loved it.
But I think Captive Prince has got kind of an unreliable narrator as well, right? Damon's narration is not accurate.
But I feel like with Damon, you're kind of learning about the world with him.
It's true.
Like through his eyes.
Yeah.
And with Will, you have his point of view. But his idea that what he's doing is right. Like he's kind of tricking you in some way.
Yeah, and there's a lot of things about him and his past that he also doesn't want to face himself. So he's lying to himself in a way.
Yes.
Yeah. So you guessed the ending because of the spoiler?
Kinda.
Yeah.
I expected him to not be the person he said he was.
Yeah.
But I really like it. I really love the plot twist. And I saw the plot twist on the cover of the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, the horns.
Oh, cool. That's so cool. Yeah. That was the artist's idea to do that, actually. She's quite amazing. The art on the cover of that book is amazing. But yeah, there's a lot of little hidden meanings in the artwork that you'll learn as you read the series. Yeah.
And I gotta say that when you read it a second time, you notice those things, like those crumbs were there telling you that something wasn't right.
Yeah, it was really interesting to plan that book, actually, because I had to, in a way, I was writing 2 books. I was writing the actual story, and then I was reading the story that all the characters believed they were in. And they both had to be there from the beginning. So, that's one case where unless I really knew the ending, I couldn't, and planned everything out, I couldn't have done that.
And that's so cool, because I feel like that's another level of planning the story.
Yeah.
I gotta ask you, this book I feel like has more different plots, intricate stories, because it also have a different point of views. You have more than one on the book. So how was it different from writing Captive Prince?
It was way more difficult. Maybe like 10 to 20 times more difficult. I think the more characters, it's just some books are harder to write than other books, technically, and I think the more characters you have, the more difficult it is. And it's a different structure as well. Like Captive Prince has it's very much a romance structure, and Dark Rise has got romance in it, but it's a hero's journey, like adventure structure. And I think that structure is more difficult. So I had to learn a lot about that structure and how it works. And I was reading like Tolkien's letters, and he said he was writing in his letters that at the end of book 1, The Fellowship of the Ring, he splits up the fellowship because he was just finding it too technically difficult to keep writing 9 characters together in the scene. And I was like, oh, I relate so much. So multiple POVs made it much more difficult. And then like, I think it just does have a more intricate plot than Captive Prince as well. And there's much more world building. You know, when you're plotting a book, you're usually plotting an arc for a character. But when you've got important pieces of world building, like objects that are important as well, you kind of need an arc for each one of those as well. So it's a lot to plan out. And even if you were to look at my diagram for Captive Prince versus my diagram for Dark Rise, the visual impact is like, oh yeah, that looks much more simple than that one. Yeah.
But I feel like it really pays off because you read the book and you see all the investigation, all the work that went behind the scenes to get that story.
I'm really happy to hear you say that. Thank you.
Something that I really like about Dark Rise is the themes and the talk about light and dark.
Yeah.
Because I feel like it's not always good and bad.
Yeah.
You have like a middle point.
Yeah.
And I was wondering what made you decide to write about the. This is going to be a spoiler. I'm so sorry, but about the villain of the story.
So, as I was saying before, you know, when I was growing up, there just weren't LGBT stories. But if there were LGBT characters or someone that was coded as LGBTQ, they're always the villain. Like every Disney villain, like Maleficent, Scar, Jafar, you know, Ursula, like all of them. As I've heard other people say, I was really lucky it did not make me hate myself or hate being queer, but it just made me love villains. You know, I had something to say about what does it mean to grow up with everyone telling you that you're the villain of the story. But also, you know, fantasy genre, and then the other part of it is like fantasy genre for me, that's the place where we make our like myths and social myths and legends. Like in the past, it was like, you know, it came from myth or religion, but I think we've like swapped out Hercules for like Harry Potter. So all our heroic figures are coming from genre fiction.
Yes.
So then it's like, who are these heroes? For me, I'm Australian, and I actually don't know what it's like in Mexico, but in Australia we grew up reading like a lot of British fantasy. So like Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, like Narnia by C.S. Lewis. And the hero is always the same. It's always like a straight British boy eating English food and walking around in the grassy fields of England. And the villain's always queer. And so, and the hero's always named Will or like Harry. And so, you know, so I wanted to make a hero like that, but then explore like, what does it mean when he's put in my situation? And I guess I wanted to, like, as much as I could, like, reclaim that queer villain. Yeah.
We're gonna end here just with a quick question about adaptations.
Yeah.
And if you would like to see one of your books adapted to a TV series or a movie, which one would it be?
So the fantasy lover in me wants to say Dark Rise because I love seeing magic and fantasy on screen. And then the chaos gremlin in me wants to say Captive Prince because I think the audience reactions would be very extreme.
I think whichever we get to see, hopefully in the future.
What about you? Which one would you like to see?
I would like to see Captive Prince, but as an animated series.
Oh, that would be amazing. Yeah, that's such a good idea.
I feel like the battles would be amazing in an animation format.
Yeah, completely agree. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us today. It's like really interesting and really cool to hear you talk about your process, your stories. I really love your mind.
Thank you so much. And thanks for chatting with me today. This is really great.
Thanks to you.
Thanks.
Okay. Nos vemos en otra ocasión, chicos, y sigan leyendo romance, fantasía y todo lo demás. Bye.